The Awakening, from the Fempiror Chronicles, by George Willson. Chapter 16. The Urufdiam Plateau. Attention, guardian of the Fempiror of the Dark West. I am Tiberius of Aram. We come seeking counsel, Tiberius announced to the wall. It was a standard greeting among the Fempiror of old, and if these Dark West were the remains of the Alewo, he hoped they would respond to his formality. A low, calm voice responded to his query, also in Fempiror, and sounded as if it came from all around him. "What allegiance do you claim?" it asked. Tiberius took a deep breath. How would be the best way to respond to such a direct question? If they were Alewo, then they might welcome Urufdiam, as the Urufdiam were known for their defense of humanity. However, if the Tepish had taken over the Dark West ideals, they might be killed as soon as the door opened. Without any way of knowing for sure, though, he decided the truth was always the best option, and if they died at the hand of the Tepish for it, they would die with their integrity. "We are warriors of the Order of Urufdiam," he replied, continuing only in Fempiror. He paused only a moment before adding, "We desire knowledge of the Order of Tepish." Zechariah drew in a breath of air. Tiberius knew all too well what Zechariah thought of his revealing it all so openly. Despite his recent rashness, Zechariah had always been known for his caution, and Tiberius doubted that Zechariah would have ever given away so much in a single moment. "The Urufdiam have always desired the knowledge of the whereabouts of the Tepish," the deep rumbling voice responded. "Why should we help you?" "What do you desire?" Tiberius asked. He was unsure what they would have to bargain with if the unknown voice actually wanted something. "Possessions mean nothing," the voice said, its tone never changing. "We desire only wisdom. How many years have you walked?" "I have walked this world over 400 years, as have two of my companions," Tiberius replied, relieved that he was likely dealing with the Alewo, as this was a normal request for the Alewo ideals he remembered. "Our knowledge may be valuable in trade." "We accept," the voice stated. With that, the door opened, revealing nothing but a hallway behind it. The six companions looked at each other for a moment. "Do we just go in?" Kaltesh asked. "Likely," Vladimir replied. "It's not uncommon for someone to permit entry to a stranger without showing their face, just in case this stranger is not a friend. I would say they're still evaluating us." "That makes sense," Zechariah said with a nod. "I believe I would be suspicious of armed Fempiror showing up at my door as well." The others agreed. "Will I be able to understand them once we get in?" David asked. Fempiror was Tiberius' first language, so he had to remind himself often that he needed to use the common tongue in order for the younger Fempiror to understand him. Kaltesh knew Fempiror well enough to have understood the exchange at the door, but Yori would have followed less of it, and David had no knowledge of the language at all. "It's hard to say, David," Tiberius said. "They spoke Fempiror at the door, so I couldn't predict whether they'll use the old language or the common tongue. We'll just have to find out." They walked through the opening, Tiberius leading the way, followed by Vladimir, then Kaltesh, Yori, David, and Zechariah. As soon as Zechariah passed through the door, it closed slowly of its own accord. Only David seemed surprised by this, as he was still unfamiliar with the ways of the Fempiror. The hallway was completely featureless with a three-way fork directly before them. Dim lights hung from the ceiling, and their eyes adjusted quickly to the gloom. A Fempiror stepped out of a recess in the hall. He was younger, probably not more than 100 years old at the most, but even through the low lights they could see he was wearing the red and black armor described by Fertide back in Urufdiam. The image of the bat was emblazoned across the chest in red lines against the black background. He could clearly see the lines of the red mail under the armor, meaning that this Fempiror was ready for an attack. He only lacked the helmet Fertide described, but this Fempiror, this clear representation of a Tepish, exactly matched Fertide's attackers. "Greetings, guests," he said politely in the common tongue with a slight smile, but clearly not the voice who had addressed them outside. "I am Fempiror. The leader of the Dark West is expecting you. Follow me." It was far kinder than Tiberius had expected after seeing the armor, and he knew David and Yori would be relieved to hear their native language. Tiberius wondered if this young red and black-clad warrior knew anything of the Tepish name or history. Could the Tepish have recruited these people for a purpose unknown to them? It was curious. Pedar walked away from them at a brisk pace. They followed closely as he passed down the unmarked and unadorned halls in such a fashion as would lose the most skilled cartographer. Tiberius glanced back to see Yori looking around, trying to memorize the layout as well as she could. Her language studies were dubious at best, but she had an enviable memory for floor plans. He suspected that this would give her quite a challenge, however. "These are some strange hallways," David said all of a sudden. His was the last voice Tiberius had expected, given how intimidating all this must surely seem to him. To his surprise, though, Pedar answered kindly, as though he were giving a tour of the caves. "It is a defense mechanism," Pedar said. "A straight path to the heart is a request for death. A difficult path discourages assassins." "Makes sense," David said with a nod. Tiberius looked back and saw Zechariah look over to the newcomer and smile. David shrugged. Tiberius turned his attention back to the road ahead in time to see the ground drop sharply to their left and open up to reveal an enormous chamber. Their path followed around one side of the chamber that was so large that the far side disappeared into the darkness. "That's quite a room," Yori commented, looking across the empty expanse. Pedar nodded. "This room serves not only as a massing area for our forces, but also for training, which has concluded for today." "How many strong are you lately?" Zechariah asked, as if it were a casual question. Tiberius thought his timing was perfect in asking, and Pedar would not likely regard it as suspicious in any way, based on the way he had been answering the questions. "We have force enough to defend ourselves," Pedar replied. "I am not qualified to divulge any further." Tiberius looked back at Zechariah, who shrugged, just as David had earlier. Tiberius smiled and turned forward again to find them passing into another enclosed hallway via the center path of another three-way fork, leaving the cavernous room behind them. After a short walk that passed through two more forks in the road, Pedar brought them before a large wooden door with ornate carvings. He turned to face them, standing between them and the room beyond. "This is the inner chamber of the Deldral of the Dark West Fempiror," he said, with more than a touch of pride in his voice. "Remember that you have been accepted upon the promises you have made." He made a shallow bow before them and walked to one side of the door. Tiberius looked at the door hopefully. He had expected Pedar to open it for them, but now he could only hope for the same situation that had occurred back at the entrance. The door opened inward of its own accord, and the same voice that addressed them outside sounded again, this time from inside the room, saying, "Enter." Without hesitation, Tiberius entered the hall of the Deldral. The room was beyond impressive. Tiberius had not seen such decoration since the Philetarus king had invited Tiberius to his chambers in the early days of the war, when the king had given him a commendation for service in battle. Light issued from gaps in the ceiling through what appeared to be a combination of the Fempiror lighting system and indirect natural light from the outside, making the room several times brighter than the halls behind them. The floor was carpeted in earthen colors of light brown and green, and tapestries containing images of unarmed Fempiror, as well as the Philetarus country, hung on the walls, marking a sharp contrast from the rock of the mountain. At the far end of the hall, sitting on an enormous rock throne, before another magnificent tapestry of a masked warrior leading an army across a darkened field, was a large Fempiror, robed in furs with long gray hair groomed behind him, and a full beard. Wisdom was set deep into his eyes, and even if he were not sitting in a seat of honor, there would be no doubt as to who was in charge, since he commanded an unbeatable presence beyond anyone else in the room as he watched the company of 6 walk toward him across his chamber. Standing to the left of the Deldral was another older Fempiror, though he appeared somewhat younger than Zechariah and Vladimir. His hair was jet black and cut short against his head, which served to complement his piercing blue eyes, yet he held an air about him that did not seem altogether right. He leaned down and whispered to the Deldral as the company approached, and while his leaders seemed to listen, the Deldral seemed disinterested in whatever this other Fempiror had to say. Tiberius stopped a short distance from the throne, and he and his 5 companions bowed to their host. The Deldral stood before them and spoke in the same deep, calm voice that spoke to them outside. Welcome to the home of the Dark West Fempiror under the Urufdiam Plateau. I am Ulrich, Deldral of the Dark West, and your host. I know you come with many questions, but it is late. Stay with us the day, and we shall answer all of your questions tonight when we are rested. You honor us with your hospitality, Ulrich, Tiberius said, and he introduced himself and his company, each of whom bowed in turn. David followed suit when Tiberius presented him as the youngest of their party. Ulrich nodded solemnly. The Dark West have always treated guests with respect, and it is expected that the same be returned. My servant will show you to your quarters. We shall meet again this evening. Until then, our home is at your disposal. You may feel free to roam at your leisure, but return when I send for you, or our deal is forfeit. That is all. With this final word, Ulrich sat back down and watched them. Tiberius watched him for a moment, trying to see behind those eyes that held a secret for another time. He heard Yori move behind him. That is all, Yori repeated with surprise. Tiberius turned to her. Yori, do not argue, he said sharply. He turned back to Ulrich to bid his leave, but the other Fempiror stepped forward. My lord, forgive me, the other Fempiror said, but they have come a long way. Perhaps there is something you would like to know now. Ulrich did not move. What I have spoken, he said, without looking at the other Fempiror, or changing his expression. The other Fempiror was clearly not satisfied with his ruler's determination of the course of action. Surely now is a far better time, the other Fempiror began, but this time Ulrich interrupted him. As you have pointed out, Nikolai, Ulrich said, still without a change of tone, they have come a long way. I do not wish to tire them unnecessarily. But what about the warrior? Kaltesh began, but Ulrich cut him off as well. All questions will be answered in due time, Ulrich said simply, but Nikolai's head snapped to Kaltesh, and his eyes narrowed in curiosity. What warrior? Nikolai asked, clearly expecting an answer from Kaltesh, but Ulrich was not going to allow it. Return to the hall, and Fempiror will take you to your rooms, Ulrich said before anyone could respond. Nikolai was not going to let it go, however. I want to know who, he began, but Ulrich put up his hand, effectively silencing Nikolai, who was unable to contend with Ulrich's authority. Tiberius glanced at Zechariah and Vladimir, who both appeared to be as confused and curious as he was. Tiberius looked back to Ulrich. We accept your invitation, Tiberius said, and look forward to speaking with you later. He bowed to Ulrich, and the others followed his lead. They turned back to the door, which, as before, opened of its own accord. Fempiror stood right outside the door waiting for them, and without a word, he walked through the maze of halls again. Tiberius led his group behind Fempiror as they wound through the labyrinth until they came to a wider passage containing a large number of doors on either side of the hall. Fempiror stopped and turned to them. These are your rooms, he said. You are welcome to rest or explore. Areas designated as secure will be marked as such. Be careful not to get lost. Good day. With that, he walked back the way they had come and disappeared into the dark maze. They all looked at the passage where Fempiror had left them. It was as unmarked as the rest of the caves, though each door had its own light along with the illumination along the ceiling. The wall and floor, though, had the same cut and texture as everything else they had seen. This would be a dreary place to live, wouldn't it? Kaltesh commented. The Alewa were always about function over lavishness, Vladimir said, though they certainly provided some decor in the chamber of the Deldral. That would be a room where such lavishness is appropriate, Zechariah said. How much would you expect in a hallway? I'm sure this is very interesting to you all, but now what? Yori asked. Well, all things aside, Tiberius said, it certainly is very curious. The warriors we've seen look nothing like the one you described from the safe house, Kaltesh said. Zechariah nodded, and the Deldral did not want anything discussed, he said. What do you all make of the armor? Tiberius asked, his question clearly directed to Zechariah and Vladimir. There was a good reason for this, of course. None of the younger three would have seen the old Tepish armor, despite the studies they had conducted with both Yori and Kaltesh on their history. It definitely harkens back to the old Tepish design, Vladimir said, right down to the meticulous bat etching and red and black coloring they always had. Ostentatious and unnecessary, I always thought it was, Zechariah said with a scoff. So we agree about the armor, then, Tiberius said. Zechariah and Vladimir nodded. Are we going to sleep? Zechariah asked. Or do you want to look around? I'm up for walking around, Vladimir said immediately. Kaltesh stepped in as well. I'm with Vladimir, he said. I want to know what the big secret is. Tiberius looked at the group for a long moment. He was with Vladimir in wanting to know what was going on, but he needed to weigh this against the fact that they had been traveling all night, and were likely more tired than they realized. Besides, they did not know what the day or night would hold for them, and they needed their strength. More than ever, he needed to convince them of the need for patience over action. The Deldral had promised to meet with them, and it was likely he would meet with them alone, so he could speak freely of what he knew. Tiberius did not consider himself their commander anymore, but he knew what he should recommend. We know nothing at this time, Tiberius said finally. We are free to do as we wish. We should rest, but be alert. I'm going to get what sleep I can for the moment, and hope that the mystery will be revealed when the Deldral deems the time is right to speak with us. Zechariah nodded. I agree, he said. I am as curious as anyone else, but suspicion aside, until reason is given to act, we should see how this plays out. He looked at David, lost in the mix behind the more experienced Fempiror. David, will you be all right on your own? David nodded. I don't think I can get into much trouble resting in an empty room, he said with a smile. Tiberius smiled as well. David finally seemed to be coming around to whoever he was before the change. We are all in our own rooms, right? David asked. No reason not to, Vladimir quickly replied, though I think David should take the center room, he said, pointing to a set of 3 doors on one side of the hall, so he's flanked by 2 more experienced Rostem, just in case. I would agree with that, Zechariah said. I'll take one of the rooms next to him. Sounds good, Tiberius said. We'll get together in a few hours if the Deldral doesn't send for us first. They all agreed, parted company, and entered their rooms.